So, I want you to picture this scenario. It is 1994.
Right, the early days of the commercial internet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the U.S. military's Rome Air Development Center in New York gets breached. But, it wasn't a physical break-in.
No broken windows or cut fences.
Right. Someone bypassed the digital security, infiltrated the network, and compromised 30 different defense systems. And from there, they pivoted, hitting the Korea Atomic Energy Research Institute, and then moved right on to strike NASA.
Which is just an incredible string of targets.
Oh, completely. The Pentagon was on high alert. You can just imagine the scene, right?
Yeah.
Cybersecurity teams scrambling, the military brass demanding answers. They're all hunting for this, highly sophisticated state-sponsored cyber terrorist cell.
Because that's what the scale of the attack suggested.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what they found was a 16-year-old British kid sitting with a computer.
Yeah.
And in that exact moment, whether they fully realized it or not, the entire history of human warfare just fundamentally changed.
It really did. It's one of those historical inflection points that feels almost too cinematic to be real. You have the entire weight of the United States military apparatus.
The billions of dollars.
Billions of dollars, decades of established doctrine, thousands of highly trained professionals, and they are momentarily frozen by a teenager in his bedroom thousands of miles away.
It's wild. And that actually brings us directly to the core of our deep dive today. We're unpacking this truly paradigm-shifting text on modern military strategy for you, our dedicated defense learner.
Right, we're getting into the really heavy strategic theory today.
We are. And it all revolves around this chilling assertion made by the strategist André Beaufry. He observed that while warfare is always changing, we've reached a point where, to quote the central metaphor of our source material, the war god's face has become indistinct.
The war god's face has become indistinct. It's such a haunting image, isn't it?
It really is. What does he actually mean by that, though?
Well, what that metaphor means is that the traditional, recognizable identity of war is just vanishing right in front of us. I mean, for thousands of years, if you looked at a conflict, you knew it was a war.
Right. It had obvious hallmarks.
Exactly. You had defined battlefields, you had uniformed soldiers facing off against each other, and you had these obvious, mutually understood objectives, like if you capture the enemy's capital, you win.
The classic rules of the game.
Right. But that face, that recognizable visage of armed conflict, it's blurring into something entirely unrecognizable now. And the source text we're analyzing today argues that if you want to understand modern global events, you have to realize that the foundational pillars of conflict haven't just shifted a little bit.
They've completely mutated.
Yes, completely transformed.
And that's exactly the mission statement for our deep dive today. We're going to lay out this structure for you so you can pass the ultimate exam of modern strategic understanding.
Which is not an easy exam to pass these days.
No, it's not. But to make sense of all these headlines you see about, cyber attacks on power grids or sudden trade embargoes, you have to understand the transformation of 4 core pillars.
Right, the 4 fundamental questions of war.
Exactly. Who fights? Where does fighting happen? Why are wars fought? And what methods are used?
Because if you grasp how those 4 elements have evolved, you basically hold the blueprint for the future of global conflict.
I like to think of the traditional concept of war like an old, predictable board game, like chess. Yeah.
Sure. Clear rules, clear board.
Right. But this new paradigm we're entering, it's more like a massive open-source digital simulation.
Yeah.
The rules and even the board itself are just constantly being overwritten while you're trying to play.
That's a great analogy. But to really understand how radically this future has diverged, we have to define that baseline first. We need to look at what the traditional components of warfare actually are.
Okay, let's unpack that. Where do we start?
Well, the text uses a really helpful framing here. It divides war into its hardware and its software. Oh, I like that. So what's the hardware?
For several millennia, there have been 3 absolutely indispensable hardware elements to any war. First is the soldier, meaning the traditional, recognized, usually uniformed warrior.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second is the weapon. These are the physical tools of destruction, right? Everything from bronze swords to rifles to heavy artillery.
Yeah, the physical gear.
Exactly. And the third hardware element is the battlefield, a clearly defined geographic location where the actual violence takes place.
So you've got the person fighting, the tool they use, and the place they stand. That's the hardware.
Correct. But as you know, hardware just sits there collecting dust unless there's an operating system telling it what to do.
Right, you need the software to run it.
Yeah.
And the software of war, as our source text defines it, is its purposefulness. It's the why.
The underlying motivation. Exactly. Why are we deploying this violent hardware in the first place? And I actually want to start our deep dive right here with the evolution of this software, the reasons why we fight. Because honestly, it sets the stage for everything else we're going to talk about.
I completely agree. And if we trace that evolution, we really have to start with ancient wars. The text points out that early warfare was, from a strategic standpoint, incredibly raw and actually relatively simple.
Simple in what way? Because ancient wars were brutal.
Oh, they're incredibly bloody, but simple in their aims. You have to remember that in the ancient world, human societies had very limited horizons. They had narrow spheres of activity and really basic survival needs.
So they weren't fighting over complex ideologies.
Not at all. The aims were straightforward, and honestly, from a modern perspective, sometimes shockingly petty. I mean, you had massive wars fought over a beautiful woman.
Like Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships.
Exactly. Or wars fought over the orthodox status of a very specific religious sect, or just for a nice expanse of pasture land with lush grass.
They needed to feed their horses, so they just went and killed the people who had the good grass.
Pretty much. Or to secure basic resources like spices. Whole armies would mobilize over a king's love affair, or just a perceived slight to a royal family.
It's so raw. The text actually highlights the absurdity of this. It mentions how historical accounts of wars over spices and sweethearts leave us not knowing whether to laugh or cry today.
Because it just seems so unfiltered.
Exactly. There was no need to dress it up for the media. If a king wanted another king's gold, he literally just marched an army over and tried to take it. But I think the perfect historical bridge to illustrate this, and this is a wild deep dive all on its own, is the English launching the Opium War against the king monarchy.
Yes, the 19th century. That is such a crucial example of this raw software at work.
Right. Because when you strip away all the Victorian romanticism and the fancy diplomatic language of the era, the source text frames the Opium War strictly as national drug trafficking.
Which is exactly what it was. State-sponsored drug running on the grandest scale in recorded history.
It's insane to think about the mechanics of that. For you listening, just pause and consider this. You have the British Empire, the most powerful global force of its day, right?
Yeah.
And they have this massive trade deficit with China because the British absolutely love tea, silk, and porcelain.
But the Chinese don't really want anything the British are manufacturing.
Exactly. The trade is totally one-sided. So what does the British East India Company do? They essentially start mass-producing opium in India and smuggling it into China just to balance their books.
To force a market.
Yes, and millions of Chinese citizens become addicted. So the king emperor finally says, okay, enough is enough. He seizes the illegal opium and he burns it.
A totally reasonable law enforcement response.
Right. And what is the British response? It isn't diplomacy. They send heavily armed gunboats to absolutely smash the Chinese coastal defenses. Why? Just to force them to keep buying illegal narcotics.
It's staggering. But that was the software running the hardware of the British military at that moment. It was purely raw material acquisition and violent market forcing. It was transactional.
No grand moral crusade.
None. And it was during this era that the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz coined his famous maxim. It reigned supreme for over a century. You've probably heard it.
War is a continuation of politics by other means.
Exactly. It was viewed as a direct, rational, straightforward instrument of state policy.
But then, as we move into the 20th century, the era of modern wars, that software gets an upgrade, doesn't it? It becomes a lot more sophisticated.
It has to. The raw land grabs are suddenly replaced by these heavy, slogan-driven forms of imperialism.
Why the shift, though? Why start using slogans?
Well, we see the emergence of the new great powers, and suddenly telling your population, hey, we're marching an army over there just to steal gold or force a drug trade, that's no longer palatable to the domestic populations.
Why? Because those are the people who actually have to go die in these trenches. They need a better reason.
Exactly. So you get the introduction of massive ideological slogans. Look at Adolf Hitler. He didn't just tell the German people he wanted to conquer neighboring countries for their wealth. He expounded the slogan of obtaining Lebensraum, or living space.
He framed it as an existential thing.
Right, a biological necessity for the survival of the German race. And similarly, Imperial Japan didn't just say, we want to extract all the rubber and oil from Southeast Asia.
They use a slogan, too, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Yes, they pitched themselves as these noble liberators, removing Western colonial powers to create a utopian Asian economic bloc.
But on the surface, those slogans suggest a much more complex, almost philosophical goal than just stealing spices.
They do, but the text acutely notes that these high-sounding slogans were essentially just marketing.
Just a shiny new user interface.
Precisely. They merely masked the traditional ancient desire to carve up colonial spheres of influence and reap the economic benefits of seized territories. The core programming of conquest and extraction was exactly the same as the ancient kings.
Okay, so that brings us to the profound shift, the post-Cold War reality. Because for roughly 4 decades after World War II, the whole world was divided by the Iron Curtain.
And during the Cold War, you had incredibly effective ideological calls to action.
Right, you had the Soviet bloc exporting revolution and supporting Marxist insurgencies everywhere. And on the other side, you had the Western bloc wholly focused on checking the expansion of communism.
Defending the free world.
Exactly. Those dual slogans organized the entire globe. The sides were clearly drawn in permanent ink. But then 1989 happens. The Berlin Wall falls. The Soviet Union collapses shortly after. And suddenly, that overarching ideological warfare just vanishes.
The software experiences a massive system-wide glitch.
I love how you phrase that, a system-wide glitch.
I've heard.
Because if the ideology is dead, what actually fills the vacuum? The text argues that we are left with this ultimate, highly cynical takeaway.
The constant of self-interest.
Yes, there's a famous geopolitical principle quoted in our source. There are no permanent friends or enemies, only interests.
It's a harsh reality. And the text provides several vivid examples to show just how volatile this has become for defense learners to analyze. It's no longer a chessboard with clearly painted white and black pieces.
Oh, the examples are wild. Look at the shifting alliances between the United States and Iraq.
Right, back in the 1980s.
Yeah, during the Iran-Iraq War. Iraq is fiercely attacking Iran, and they are acting essentially as a bulwark for U.S. interests in the region. The U.S. is actively providing intelligence, economic aid, diplomatic cover to Saddam Hussein. They are de facto allies.
But then you just roll the tape forward a few years to 1990.
Right. Iraq invades Kuwait. And the very next year, Iraq itself becomes the target of a massive, devastating attack by the U.S. military. The ally literally became the ultimate enemy practically overnight.
It's dizzying. And it's definitely not an isolated incident. The text brings up the Afghan Mujahideen.
Oh, this is a perfect example.
Right. In the 1980s, the CIA is pouring money and Stinger missiles into Afghanistan to train these guerrilla fighters to bleed the Soviet army. They are hailed as freedom fighters in Washington.
But fast forward to the late 90s and early 2000s.
And those exact same fighters, sometimes the exact same individuals, have become the prime targets of U.S. cruise missiles.
It's like the board just flipped upside down. And the text even looks at established alliances like NATO. You have Greece and Turkey.
Two nations ostensibly allied under the NATO umbrella.
Right, bound by a literal treaty to defend one another. Yet they have nearly come to blows, scrambling fighter jets against each other multiple times over the contested status of Cyprus.
The text also mentions Japan and South Korea. Both are staunch U.S. allies, both share a treaty of alliance, both have highly integrated economies, yet they continually clash diplomatically and deploy naval assets over tiny, uninhabited islands.
In the Sea of Japan, or the East Sea, depending on who you ask.
Right. This is the volatile kaleidoscope of self-interest that the text describes. The kaleidoscope is just constantly being turned by the hands of raw national interest, presenting these constantly shifting, completely unpredictable images.
Okay, I have to jump in here and push back on this a little bit, because as a learner trying to grasp strategy, this raises a massive red flag for me.
How so?
Well, if the software of war is now just this constantly spinning kaleidoscope of self-interest, where your ally today is your target tomorrow, and your proxy fighter is suddenly launching terror attacks against you, how does a military strategist even begin to define a clear mission objective?
It's incredibly difficult.
I mean, how do you know what you are actually fighting for if the ground is always moving?
That right there is exactly the friction point that drives the evolution of modern strategy. Because the software of national interest is constantly shifting, the actual goals on the ground have become incredibly blurred and multi-layered.
We're not just dealing with a unifying objective like defeat communism anymore.
No, the text describes this as a dizzying tapestry of agendas. The triggers for modern disputes are literally everywhere now. Well, you can still spark a conflict over territory, sure, but also over resources, religious beliefs, tribal hatred, ideology, market share, power distribution, trade sanctions, and even domestic financial unrest.
Hey, domestic financial unrest can trigger an international war.
Absolutely. Any single one of those, or a complex combination of them, can ignite a conflict today.
Wow. And this brings us to a core conceptual mechanism that the source material uses to explain how modern wars are actually fought in practice. Because there were so many competing agendas, contemporary warfare almost always operates on two very distinct levels.
The overt goal and the covert goal.
Yes. This is a crucial takeaway for you listening. The text explains that the high-sounding, publicly stated reason for a war, the overt goal, functions essentially as an umbrella.
It provides political cover.
Exactly. It gives the public a righteous reason to support the conflict. But underneath that umbrella, sheltered from the direct light of public scrutiny and international law, are the actual calculating national interest.
To covert goals.
Right. And I think we need to do a deep dive case study on this to make the mechanics really clear. The text uses Operation Desert Storm, the 1991 Gulf War, as the ultimate example of this overt versus covert dynamic. So let's dissect it.
Let's do it.
If you look at the public broadcasts from 1990, the overt goal is incredibly clear and righteous. Saddam Hussein's large, aggressive army invaded a tiny, weak, sovereign neighbor, Kuwait.
Right, an unprovoked attack.
So the narrative is that the international community must unite to repel the invader and restore justice and international law. That is a massive, incredibly effective umbrella.
It was. It allowed for a brilliantly constructed global coalition based on that overt moral premise. But if we look under the umbrella, the text outlines the covert goals of the participating nations, and it is an absolute masterclass in fractured self-interest.
Let's break it down nation by nation, starting with the Western powers.
Okay, for all the Western powers involved, the U.S., Britain, France, the primary unifying covert goal was brutally economic. It was protecting their oil lifeline in the Middle East.
Because if Saddam held Kuwait and threatened Saudi Arabia,
he would control a massive percentage of the global energy supply. That was simply unacceptable to Western economies.
But the U.S. wasn't just there for the oil, right? To that base economic goal, the text argues the United States added a grand strategic aspiration.
Yes. You have to remember, the Cold War had literally just ended. The U.S. had just emerged as the sole global superpower, and they wanted to cement that reality. Desert Storm was the proving ground for building a new world order with USA stamped firmly upon it.
It was a demonstration of unrivaled hegemony.
Precisely. Now look at the regional players. Take Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, their calculation was fascinating.
They invited hundreds of thousands of American and Western troops onto their sovereign soil. In doing so, they were willing to smash long-held, deeply entrenched religious and cultural taboos regarding non-Muslim armies operating in the birthplace of Islam.
The text actually describes this as Saudi Arabia being willing to dance with wolves.
Exactly. Why would they take such a massive domestic political risk? Because their overriding covert goal was eliminating a close existential military threat Saddam's army before it crossed their border. It was pure survival.
Then you have Great Britain. From start to finish, the British reacted enthusiastically to President George H.W. Bush's moves, committing massive troop numbers.
Now, obviously, they shared the oil interests with the U.S.
Sure, but the text highlights an intriguing underlying geopolitical motive for the Brits, repaying a strategic debt.
Ah, the Falklands.
Right. A decade earlier, during the Falkland Islands War, or the Malvinas War, the U.S. provided critical, albeit quiet, logistical and intelligence support to the British against Argentina. According to this analysis, standing shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. in the Gulf was essentially Britain settling its strategic accounts with Uncle Sam.
That makes perfect sense in the realm of realpolitik. And then there's France.
Oh, the French motive is my favorite part of this analysis.
The text notes that France was initially very hesitant and only sent troops at the very last moment. Their covert calculation wasn't about the early idealism of freeing Kuwait at all.
No, it was purely diplomatic survival.
Yes, it was solely to prevent the complete evaporation of their traditional diplomatic and economic influence in the Middle East. France realized that if the U.S. and Britain won this massive victory and completely reshaped the region, and France hadn't contributed blood and treasure, they would lose their seat at the regional table entirely.
They essentially fought just to remain relevant.
Exactly.
So when you lay out that staggering array of covert motives, oil, global hegemony, regional survival, repaying old favors, maintaining diplomatic relevance, you realize a modern coalition war cannot possibly be a contest fought over a single objective. It's a miracle they can agree on a battle plan. How does that even work mathematically?
The text introduces a fascinating concept to explain it. It's called the largest common denominator.
The largest common denominator, like in fractions.
Kind of. The so-called common interest of an allied coalition isn't actually a shared purity of purpose. It is merely a mathematical aggregate of these selfish agendas. The coalition leaders have to find the specific set of actions that every individual party can accept to justify the joint prosecution of the war.
Okay, so as long as kicking Iraq out of Kuwait satisfies the U.S. desire for a new world order,
Mm.
and the Saudi desire for border security, and the French desire for relevance, the coalition holds together.
Exactly. That shared action is the largest common denominator.
And what's wild is that the text points out this fracture of motives happens internally, too. It's not just nation against nation.
No, it happens domestically.
Right, even within a single country, different domestic interest groups are pursuing their own agendas during a war. The defense contractors want to showcase their new weapons systems to drive future global sales.
The politicians want to bump in their polling numbers before the next election.
The oil executives want market stability. The interrelationships are so complex that you can't just pigeonhole the Gulf War as being solely about oil or solely about a new world order.
It's all of them, operating simultaneously in a state of constant tension.
Which perfectly explains why the software of war is so difficult to grasp today. And this conceptual expansion leads us directly to the next evolution we need to cover.
The battlefield itself.
Yes, because if the goals of war, both overt and covert, have expanded from simple land grabs to covering virtually every aspect of national survival, economics, and global influence, then the physical location of war had to expand to accommodate those goals. We have to look at the expanding geometry of the battlefield.
I really love this part of the text because it forces you to build a mental map of how the physical space of combat has mutated over time. It's crucial for the listener to visualize this.
Let's trace this geometric expansion for them. It starts with the absolute simplest form, the point battlefield.
Right. This is pre-firearms. Think of the ancient world or the Middle Ages. You have compact, face-to-face combat. Two armies march out, they meet in a narrow mountain pass or a tight valley, or they besiege a single city square.
So the actual killing takes place in a geographically isolated point.
Exactly. If you were 5 miles away from that point, you were perfectly safe. You could literally farm your fields while a battle raged just over the hill.
But then, human ingenuity introduces firearms and artillery. And this forces a mechanical change on the battlefield.
You could no longer stand shoulder to shoulder in tight phalanxes. One cannonball would take out an entire row of men.
Right, formations had to disperse just to survive.
This forced that isolated point to stretch outward, creating the line battlefield. And this evolution culminated horrifyingly in the First World War, with continuous lines of skirmishers and trenches extending for hundreds of miles across the European continent.
But those WWI trenches didn't just stay as thin single lines, did they?
No, they couldn't. As artillery became heavier and machine guns more prevalent, armies couldn't just stand in one shallow ditch. They had to dig deep networks.
Fallback trenches, communication trenches, reinforced concrete bunkers.
Yes, and this transformed the line into an area battlefield. We're talking combat zones that were dozens of miles deep, filled with pillboxes, overlapping fields of fire, and miles of barbed wire entanglements.
The text actually refers to this terrifying depth of the area battlefield as the meat grinder and the slaughterhouse.
It's a very apt description. The space literally consumed millions of men.
But the explosive development of military technology in the 20th century refused to be contained by the ground. It rapidly pushed warfare vertically, creating the three-dimensional battlefield.
And here, it's vital to understand that technology alone doesn't change war. It requires active innovating by military strategists who figure out how to actually use the new tools.
Right, you need the thinkers. The text highlights a few key historical theorists who forced this 3D expansion, and these are important names for our listeners to memorize. First, you have the British theorist J.F.C. Fuller.
Fuller is crucial. He conceptualized the mass use of tanks. The tank was designed specifically to break the static, muddy stalemate of the area battlefield by providing mobile armor and concentrated firepower.
And right around the exact same time, you have the Italian theorist Giulio Douhet, who championed the concept of command of the air.
Suddenly, the sky isn't just a place for reconnaissance balloons.
Right, it's an active threat vector. You have Fuller's tanks roaring over the trenches below, while Zeppelins and early propeller planes are dropping bombs from above.
The battlefield is now a cube, not a flat plane.
Then the doctrine gets even more sophisticated. You have the Soviet Marshal, Mikhail Tukhachevsky.
Tukhachevsky. He proposed and demonstrated the concept of deep operations.
How did that differ from what came before?
Well, before Tukhachevsky, armies mostly focused on destroying the troops directly in front of them. Deep operations argued for striking simultaneously at the front lines and far behind the enemy's lines.
So targeting their supply depots, their reserves, their command centers.
Exactly. To induce total paralysis and disrupt their entire system of defense at once.
And we also have to talk about Erich Ludendorff, the German general from WWI. The text highlights his theory of total war. Now, what did that actually look like conceptually?
Ludendorff argued that the battlefield wasn't just the trenches. He attempted to combine battlefield elements with non-battlefield elements, like civilian industrial production, into one organic whole.
So he realized that the factory worker making the artillery shell back in Berlin was just as crucial to the war effort as the soldier firing it at Verdun.
Precisely. While his practical success was limited geographically during WWI, he was the harbinger of a massive psychological shift. The idea that the civilian rear area is a valid military target.
Which brings the text to Adolf Hitler's role in this geometric expansion. Now, the authors are careful to note that Hitler was neither a grand strategic genius nor a brilliant tactician.
No, but relying on a brutal intuition, he pushed this concept of total war further.
Right, by utilizing bombers with powerful Mercedes engines, and later the V-1 flying bombs and V-2 ballistic missiles, Hitler managed to break the sanctuary of the British Isles.
Explain the mechanics of that for the listener, because the V-2 was truly revolutionary, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Think about it. Before ballistic missiles, a soldier's or civilian's fate was largely determined by the maximum range of an enemy artillery piece. If you were 20 miles behind the front lines, comfortably out of range, you could sleep soundly.
But Hitler's use of V-2 rockets changed the math completely.
It meant a weapon could be launched from the continent, pass high over the front lines, over the English Channel, and strike deep into the civilian rear of London. He practically erased the partition separating the fighting front from the non-combatant rear.
He stretched the line between the soldier and the civilian until it snapped.
I like to think of this geometric expansion, from point to line to area to 3D, like a virus escaping a petri dish.
That's a great visual.
It starts as a contained point in the dish, then it spreads into a line, that it covers the area of the gel, and finally it goes airborne, escaping the dish entirely and infecting the 3D atmosphere of the laboratory. It simply refuses to be contained by its original boundaries.
That's a highly accurate analogy. Because the virus of war didn't stop at the atmosphere, expanding the physical map, what we call the macroscopic space, wasn't enough. The true revolution, according to the source text, is war leaving the physical Earth entirely.
We are currently witnessing the leap into unlimited non-natural space.
This is where we go from 3D to infinite extension. The text details the push into the absolute furthest extremes of natural space. We have space warfare, utilizing networks of satellites for targeting and communication.
We have underwater warfare utilizing nuclear submarines hiding in the deep oceans for months at a time.
We have global ballistic missiles that exit the atmosphere and can reach literally anywhere on the globe in less than 30 minutes.
And terrifyingly, we have the expansion into the psychological domain, attacking the inner world of the human heart through propaganda and terror, so that there is no mental refuge left.
The text uses a great phrase for this, saying there are nets above and snares below.
But here is the critical distinction you must grasp to truly understand modern conflict. Mechanical enlargement of the physical, natural battlefield is over.
Right. Pushing a submarine further into the Mariana Trench or putting a satellite higher into orbit is just a continuation of physics. It's just a bigger board game.
The future of the battlefield lies in what the text calls non-natural or technological space.
This is where the rules of the game are completely rewritten. It's not just about occupying physical territory anymore. The text breaks down 3 specific future battle spaces that exist in this technological realm. Let's unpack them.
Okay, first is the electromagnetic spectrum space.
This is a battle space that stems entirely from technological creativity. In the electromagnetic spectrum, concepts of length, width, and height, or land, sea, and air, completely lose their significance.
Why is that?
Because electromagnetic signals can permeate and control conventional space without actually occupying any of it.
Explain how that works in practice. How do you win a battle without occupying the space?
Think about electronic warfare. If an enemy has a massive fleet of advanced fighter jets, traditionally you would have to send your own jets into their airspace to shoot them down.
Right. Dogfights.
But in the electromagnetic space, you don't need to cross their border. You can use directed energy or advanced jamming to blind their radar systems, scramble their communications, and sever the data links to their smart weapons.
Wow.
Their jets are physically intact, sitting on the runway or flying in the air, but they are operationally useless. You have defeated them in the electromagnetic spectrum, controlling their physical space without ever physically entering it.
That is wild. Okay, the second technological battle space is network space.
Yes, this is a blend of electronics, information technology, and specific system designs.
This is the realm of data, network servers, interconnected infrastructure, and the internet itself. It's a completely man-made geography.
And third, perhaps the most sci-fi element mentioned in the text is nanometer space.
The micro level.
Exactly. The text suggests that warfare prosecuted in the nanometer space using nanotechnology, microsensors, and microscopic mechanical agents bodes well for the realization of a terrifying dream.
A war without the direct physical involvement of people on the front lines.
Correct. So what does this all mean when you put it together? The expert analysis drives home a chilling conclusion. The battlefield is now omnipresent. Conventional physical space and technological space completely overlap.
The text asks us to imagine a scenario where a conflict initiated in a sterile computer room or a manipulation executed on a stock exchange trading floor can completely doom an enemy nation.
If a country's power grid can be shut off remotely or its currency collapsed by an algorithm,
Then there is absolutely no longer any such thing as non-battle space. If a young soldier asks today, where is the battlefield? The answer is simply everywhere.
which logically forces us to re-examine the third core pillar of our deep dive, who fights.
Right, because if the battlefield is no longer a muddy trench, but is instead a stock exchange, a network server, or the electromagnetic spectrum,
The person fighting the war can no longer be a traditional infantryman with a rifle.
we must look at the radical shift in the warrior. The fundamental nature of the combatant is evolving just as drastically as the geography of the battlefield. It's a complete shift in physicality and required skill set.
Let's trace this evolution of the warrior. We started with the strong warrior. The text explicitly notes the end of the era where the, quote, strong and brave lowbrow with bulging biceps was the heroic, indispensable defender of the nation.
For thousands of years, combat was all about physical leverage. Swinging a heavier sword, drawing a heavier bow, surviving brutal hand-to-hand combat.
But brute physical strength is no longer the primary currency of combat. From the strong warrior of antiquity, we move to the professional soldier of the 20th century.
Right, this was the soldier shaped by big industry, mass production, and mechanized warfare.
They were essentially cast and formed on the assembly lines of the industrial age, trained to operate heavy machinery like tanks and artillery in highly disciplined units.
But the wave of information technology makes that massive, mechanized army almost too grandiose, too slow, and too inefficient. So we arrive at what the text calls the digital fighter, or the technological elite.
The authors paint a very different picture of a modern soldier here. They suggest the most lethal combatant might be a pasty-faced scholar wearing thick eyeglasses, sitting in an air-conditioned room thousands of miles away.
Because of the nature of modern weapon systems, drones, cyber weapons, long-range precision missiles, this digital fighter is totally insulated from the visceral dripping blood of the conventional battlefield. They execute devastating attacks from far beyond visual range.
However, the real revolution outlined in the text isn't just that the military personnel look different or use computers instead of rifles. The truly disruptive change, the one that keeps defense strategists awake at night, is the realization that civilians have barged into the war room.
The historical division of labor, where war was the exclusive, walled-off imperial garden of the professional uniformed soldier, is completely over.
The uninvited guests have arrived, and the primary, most disruptive example of this is the computer hacker acting as a combatant.
This is where the line between a teenager playing a prank in a basement and a state-sponsored existential threat completely vanishes. Which brings us back to the story we started with.
The Rome Air Development Center breach.
Right. You have a 16-year-old British teenager named Richard Price, using the handle Beat-a-Stream Cowboy, infiltrating a critical U.S. military facility, compromising 30 systems.
And what astounded defense experts wasn't just the magnitude of the access he gained, it was the absolute democratization of the threat. Now, naturally, an intrusion by a teenager using basic tools cannot legally or morally be regarded as a formal act of war by the UK against the US.
No, of course not.
But here is the staggering context the text provides. In that exact same year, 1994, there were an estimated 230,000 security intrusions into Department of Defense networks.
230,000. That is a mind-boggling number. That's hundreds of attacks a day on the most secure military networks on Earth.
Exactly. And this poses the ultimate strategic dilemma for modern defense. How do you identify the attacker in real time?
How does a commander know for certain which piece of malicious code is a curious middle schooler playing a game, and which is an organized, destructive act of warfare launched by a hostile nation-state?
The camouflage provided by the internet hides all of them in the exact same technological space. By the time you figure out who is attacking you, the power grid might already be down.
And it gets more complicated, because some of these hackers are motivated by sheer ideology, acting almost like lone knights errant, completely outside of state control.
The text mentions a hacker group called Millworm.
Right. In the late 90s, they hacked into India's Baba Atomic Research Center. Why did they do it? They weren't paid by Pakistan or the U.S. They did it simply to protest India's recent nuclear weapons tests.
They altered the facility's homepage and downloaded massive amounts of data. The text makes a profound observation here. In the information age, the geopolitical influence exerted by a teenager with a modem might exceed the influence of a nuclear bomb.
It's terrifying. The text provides another compelling example.
Yeah.
Hackers who bypassed the Suharto government's digital blockade to expose horrific ethnic violence in Indonesia to the rest of the world.
They were acting on their own moral values, completely unbound by the rules of international diplomacy or the sovereignty of the Indonesian state. They injected themselves into a geopolitical crisis and changed the outcome.
So individual hackers act on their own. But this brings us to an even more severe organized threat. What happens when non-state actors organize themselves with military discipline, driven by extreme creeds or religious fervor, but operate with absolutely no adherence to the laws of armed conflict?
We are seeing the rise of what the text provocatively calls ruleless rodents.
Rodents. Let's dig into that.
The text profiles this rising threat of extremist non-state organizations. It points to Osama bin Laden's terrorist network and the devastating 1998 embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. It points to the Japanese Aum Shinrikyo cult, a doomsday group who managed to manufacture and discharge weaponized sarin poison gas in a Tokyo subway in 1995.
It also mentions heavily armed Caucasian militias operating domestically within the United States.
What unifies these disparate groups is that they have a military flavor, they are highly organized, but they are not bound by the Geneva Conventions, rules of engagement, or traditional statecraft.
And this leads to a really striking visceral analogy in the source text, contrasting traditional professional armies with these new organizations.
Yes, the dinosaurs versus the rodents.
Professional state armies, like the U.S. military or the British Armed Forces, are likened to gigantic dinosaurs. They are massive, incredibly powerful, heavily armored, but ultimately trapped by their own bureaucratic weight, their adherence to international law, and their pursuit of limited political goals.
Non-state organizations, however, are described as rodents with great powers of survival. Let's unpack that analogy because it explains the mechanics of asymmetrical warfare perfectly. How does a rodent torment a dinosaur?
Well, the dinosaur is bound by physics and its own massive bulk. It can only move in certain ways.
Exactly. A state military is bound by public opinion, congressional oversight, and international treaties. The rodent has none of those constraints. These non-state actors use unlimited means, they observe no rules, they hide in the shadows of the state's own infrastructure, and they use their sharp teeth to gnaw at the dinosaur's vulnerable ankles.
They use the state's own freedoms, freedom of movement, open communication, open financial systems against it.
Absolutely.
So, as someone trying to make sense of this, I have to ask the obvious frustrating question that this raises. How can a nation-state possibly win?
It's a tough question.
If you are a democratic country forced to fight a limited war, constrained by international law, domestic public opinion, and strict military regulations, how do you defeat an enemy that is fighting an unlimited war, willing to use suicide bombers, poison gas on civilians, or mass cyber attacks? It seems like the dinosaur is doomed.
That anxiety is the defining characteristic of modern strategic thought. The traditional military toolkit is simply insufficient for this new reality. And to fight these new threats, operating in these new technological spaces, the very methods of war had to evolve.
Which brings us to the fourth and final pillar of our deep dive: what methods are used?
The source text links heavily on American military doctrine to explain this evolution, noting that U.S. pragmatism and massive defense budgets have driven much of this new theory. Let's break down the 4 specific U.S. forms of future war, as outlined in the text by General Gordon R. Sullivan.
Former Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. Let's go through them. Form number 1, information warfare.
General Sullivan maintained that this will be the basic foundational form of future combat. It's about controlling the data, disrupting the enemy's ability to communicate, and maintaining dominance over the narrative and the network. If you lose the information war, you lose the physical war.
Form number 2, precision warfare. The Americans often refer to this as non-contact attack.
This relies heavily on a web of advanced technologies. The Global Positioning System, GPS stealth technology to evade radar, and C4I systems.
C4I. That stands for Command Control, Communications, Computers, and Intelligence. Explain the goal of precision warfare, though, because it seems like an attempt to sanitize conflict.
It absolutely is. The goal of precision warfare is concealment, speed, surgical accuracy, high effectiveness, and crucially low collateral damage. The U.S. military wanted to dispense with the nightmare of traditional attrition warfare, the WWI meat grinder we talked about earlier.
So instead of dropping 10,000 dumb bombs to destroy a factory and flattening a city block in the process,
You use one stealth bomber to drop one GPS-guided munition precisely through the ventilation shaft of the factory. It's the application of overwhelming technological superiority to minimize political fallout.
Okay, form number 3, joint operations. This is the natural evolution of traditional cooperative operations. It's no longer just the Army fighting on land and the Navy fighting at sea.
Right, it's combining land, air, sea, space, and cyber forces seamlessly into one integrated, synchronized fist.
And then we arrive at form number 4, which is a bureaucratic mouthful. MOTW, military operations other than war. Now, stop right here. We need to dissect this because this next distinction is absolutely critical to understanding the entire thesis of the source text for your exam.
Yes, you have to understand the difference between the American concept of MOTW and a revolutionary paradigm-shifting concept the text introduces called non-military war operations.
They sound incredibly similar, but they are conceptually the complete inverse of one another. Let's define them clearly. Let's start with MOTW.
MOTW is essentially the military acting outside of its traditional combat role. It's the Pentagon putting a label on missions carried out by armed forces when there is no officially declared state of war.
So this includes things like UN peacekeeping missions, deploying the Navy for drug suppression in the Caribbean, using troops for riot control, providing disaster relief after a hurricane, or evacuating foreign nationals from a collapsing state.
Exactly. MOTW is soldiers doing civilian things. It is the U.S. military taking its massive, organized weight and trying to put complex, non-traditional problems into a neat, manageable military box.
But the text argues that the military won't be able to keep the future of conflict inside that neat little box. The world is too complex.
And that leads us to the author's revolutionary concept, non-military war operations. This is the complete inverse of MOTW.
This isn't the military doing civilian tasks. This is using completely non-military fields of human endeavor economics, finance, media, ecology, international law to achieve the destructive, coercive effects of a hot war.
So instead of soldiers doing civilian things, it's civilians or civilian tools doing the work of soldiers. It is extending our understanding of warfare to encompass literally every conceivable means of coercion.
And if war has expanded into all fields of human endeavor, we have to look at what these new weapons actually look like. We are entering the arsenal of non-military warfare. And I want to pause and emphasize something here.
What's that?
As we go through this list, we are objectively cataloging the claims made in this strategic text to understand how this specific doctrine views the modern landscape. Whether you agree with these classifications or see some of them as conspiratorial, it's crucial to understand that this is the lens through which future conflict is being modeled.
That's a very important framing. We are analyzing the doctrine impartially. So let's open up this new expanded arsenal. First weapon, trade war.
Now, we hear trade war in the news all the time, usually referring to protecting local businesses or steel tariffs.
But the text means something much more aggressive. It's using domestic trade law and economic leverage as a devastating international weapon. This includes the arbitrary erection of massive tariff barriers, strict embargoes on critical technologies like semiconductors, and crippling trade sanctions.
And the text points to a very specific example, the devastating U.S. 8-year embargo against Iraq in the 1990s. The doctrine argues that cutting off a nation's ability to trade for medical supplies, infrastructure parts, and basic goods is the classic textbook example of a trade war having a destructive, lethal effect equal to a massive military bombing campaign.
People die, infrastructure crumbles, the state weakens all without firing a single shot.
Next, and the text gives this immense detailed focus, is financial war.
The authors describe financial war as a hyper-strategic weapon.
Why hyper-strategic?
Because it is highly destructive, it allows for completely concealed actions. You don't know who is pulling the strings until it's over, and the global, digitized nature of markets makes it easily manipulated.
Okay, we need to spend some time explaining the mechanics here. Because to the average person, moving money around doesn't feel like dropping a bomb. How does a currency devaluation act as a weapon of war?
The prime example the text uses is the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s, where international mobile capital crippled the economies of the rapidly growing nations known as the Little Tigers, like Thailand, South Korea, and Indonesia.
How did that actually work?
It works by exploiting the vulnerabilities of a nation's economic structure. In a financial war, aggressors, often massive hedge funds or coordinated speculators, use vast amounts of capital to launch a sudden, overwhelming speculative attack against a target nation's currency.
They short-sell the currency in massive volumes.
Exactly, causing its value to plummet. The target government panics, burns through its foreign reserves trying to prop up the currency, and eventually fails. Interest rates skyrocket, businesses go bankrupt overnight, unemployment explodes, and the stock market crashes.
The text argues that a sudden, engineered defeat on the economic front can precipitate a near-total collapse of the social and political order. It causes widespread poverty, riots, and government collapse, chaos, and casualties that rival a conventional regional war.
And what's wild is that the text names names here, conceptualizing prominent financial actors as literal combatants. It points directly to the billionaire investor George Soros and his quantum fund as a primary protagonist of financial warfare during the Asian crisis.
Now again, whether you view Soros as an architect of a financial war or simply a ruthless investor who saw a market vulnerability and exploited it for profit, the point is that this strategic doctrine views his actions as a devastating weapon deployed against sovereign states.
And the text notes he doesn't have a monopoly on this concept. States do it too. The doctrine argues that German Chancellor Helmut Kohl brilliantly used the Deutschmark to breach the Berlin Wall.
Wait, explain that. How did he use currency to defeat the Soviet sphere?
When East and West Germany were negotiating reunification, Kohl made a heavily criticized, incredibly bold move. He offered to exchange the weak, practically worthless East German mark for the powerhouse West German Deutschmark at a 1-to-1 ratio for basic savings.
Economically, many experts thought that was madness.
It did, but strategically it was a masterstroke. By flooding East Germany with hard, valuable Western currency, he instantly integrated the East German populace into the Western economic sphere, utterly destroying any remaining legitimacy or function of the Soviet-backed East German state apparatus.
He achieved with a currency exchange rate what decades of NATO artillery shells never could. He dissolved the enemy state.
Exactly. That is financial war.
That is fascinating. The text also claims that during the Asian financial crisis, Taiwan deliberately used the chaos to devalue its own currency, specifically to launch a financial attack against Hong Kong stocks, aiming to weaken a regional rival.
It even implicates major Western credit rating agencies like Morgan Stanley and Moody's as indirect participants. The theory is that by downgrading a country's credit rating, these agencies act like forward observers in an artillery unit. They point out vulnerable targets for the big financial fish to attack.
And the arsenal continues expanding beyond finance. We have the new terror war. Now, we discussed traditional terror earlier, bombings, hijackings, assassinations. But high-tech terror is different.
The text uses the example of Italy's Falange armed forces.
Yeah.
This isn't a group of masked killers hiding in a cave. It's a sophisticated, high-tech organization that hacks into the networks of banks and mainstream news organizations.
Their goal isn't to kill people.
No, it's to destroy stored financial data, delete critical programs, and spread massive amounts of disinformation. It is terrorism directed against the infrastructure of truth and commerce.
Then there is ecological war. This feels like something out of a James Bond villain's playbook, but the doctrine takes it seriously.
This is where modern technology is employed to manipulate the natural environment itself as a weapon.
The text suggests the possibility of altering precipitation patterns to cause droughts or floods, attempting to trigger localized earthquakes, or intentionally damaging the ozone layer over an enemy nation.
It posits a near future where a man-made El Nino or La Nina effect becomes a superweapon, likely wielded by a desperate non-state organization willing to risk a global ecological holocaust to achieve their aims.
And to show the sheer scale of this conceptual expansion, the text provides a rapid-fire catalog of several other forms of non-military warfare. You have psychological warfare, which is using targeted rumors, deepfakes, and propaganda to intimidate a population and break an enemy's political will.
You have smuggling warfare, intentionally flooding a target country with cheap, illegal goods to throw their domestic markets into confusion and bankrupt their local industries.
You have media warfare, which we see playing out daily, manipulating what people see and hear on international broadcasting and social networks to lead global public opinion and isolate an enemy state.
There's drug warfare, intentionally spreading addiction and disaster within a rival nation for illicit profit and social destabilization, a modern echo of the Opium War.
Network warfare, disrupting the internet. Technological warfare, where a nation or corporation creates monopolies by independently setting mandatory global industry standards, forcing everyone else to pay them royalties.
There is resource warfare, controlling the supply of rare earth minerals or water. Cultural warfare, aggressively exporting your nation's cultural products, movies, music, fashion to lead cultural trends, and slowly assimilate opposing views, making the enemy youth sympathetic to you.
And finally, international law warfare, where a nation seizes the opportunity to set up global regulations, treaties, and human rights tribunals specifically designed to trap and constrain their geopolitical opponents.
It is genuinely overwhelming.
It really is. It's an infinitely diverse, almost paralyzing array of options. If everything from a pop song to a currency fluctuation to a computer virus is a weapon, where does it end?
Which leads us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire discussion. If we boil down everything we've unpacked today into one final unifying equation for the future of war, the expert text gives us this formulation.
What is it?
Future war equals military plus non-military, lethal plus non-lethal, visible plus invisible. It is a seamless, toxic cocktail mixture of all these elements happening simultaneously.
And because the methods have expanded to include everything, that fundamentally changes the ultimate goal of warfare. For Clausewitz, the goal was using armed force to force the enemy to accept your will.
But in this new paradigm, that definition is far too narrow. The new definition, the ultimate goal of future conflict, is using all means whatsoever, military and non-military, lethal and non-lethal, to force the enemy to serve one's own interests.
To lock this in for you, the dedicated learner, here is the powerful recall anchor you need to take away from this deep dive. If you forget the dates and the names and the specific hacks, just remember this one phrase that perfectly summarizes our new reality.
The battlefield is everywhere, everyone can become a participant, and every tool can become a weapon.
It perfectly encapsulates Beaufry's initial assertion. The war god's face hasn't disappeared. It hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
It has simply become the face of everything around us.
Exactly right.
And so I want to leave you with one final chilling thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. It builds on everything we've uncovered in this text. If every tool you interact with, your smartphone, your retirement account, your local weather, the news feed you scroll through, is potentially a weapon of statecraft.
And if the battlefield is literally everywhere, encompassing the server farms, the stock exchanges, and the electromagnetic spectrum around you.
How do you, in your daily life, even begin to define the difference between a state of war and a state of peace? Keep diving deep and stay curious.